5 days. That number is going to haunt military strategists for a generation. 5 days from the first precision strike against Israel's primary logistics infrastructure to the point where 120,000 deployed Israeli soldiers found themselves unable to advance, unable to be resupplied, and unable to safely extract from their positions. 5 days to functionally paralyze a military force that the United States and Israel spent 50 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building and sustaining. What I am about to walk you through is not commentary. It is a forensic examination of a military collapse, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic battle, but creeps in through the back door of logistics, supply chains, and the invisible architecture that every modern army depends on to breathe. If this kind of operational analysis is what you're looking for, the real mechanics beneath the headline, subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. What we cover here is the kind of analysis that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, and your engagement is what keeps it going. Now, let's get into it. I spent decades inside the American national security apparatus. I served as chief of staff to the Secretary of State. I sat in rooms where the real decisions were made. Across all of that time, across every conflict I studied, every war plan I reviewed, every intelligence assessment I read, I have never seen a supply chain interdiction campaign executed with the speed, the precision, and the comprehensive strategic logic that Iran has now demonstrated against the IDF. What happened in these 5 days will be studied in war colleges for a generation, not because it was dramatic, but because it was devastatingly, almost surgically complete. To understand why, you first need to understand what a modern army's supply chain actually looks like. The popular image, trucks driving to the front with boxes of ammunition, is roughly as accurate as describing a modern fighter jet as a flying machine with guns. A military logistics system is a complex, interdependent architecture with multiple nodes, multiple pathways, and multiple redundancies, specifically engineered to survive disruption at any single point. The IDF system, refined over 50 years with American technical assistance and sustained by American military aid, was among the most sophisticated logistics architectures in the region. Iran's operational planners understood that architecture in specific detail. They understood where the redundancies existed. And more importantly, this is where the professional sophistication of this campaign becomes genuinely striking. They understood that simultaneous attack across all redundant pathways at the same moment eliminates the redundancy advantage entirely. There's no backup when every backup has been struck simultaneously. Phase 1 opened at 2:40 inches the morning on day 1 with simultaneous precision strikes against Israel's 3 functioning port facilities. Ashdod, the primary military import terminal handling approximately 55% of IDF equipment and munitions imports by sea, absorbed 34 impacts in a strike package lasting 28 minutes. The targeting inside Ashdod was not random. Container handling cranes serving the military cargo terminal was struck individually. The fuel offloading pier was destroyed in a sequencing pattern designed to produce complete structural collapse rather than repairable damage. The bonded military warehouse complex received penetrating warhead impacts calculated to achieve internal detonation of stored munitions, not merely to collapse the external structure, but to destroy what was inside it. Haifa, the northern port serving as the primary logistics gateway for forces on the northern front, absorbed 41 strikes, focused specifically on its military fuel terminal and the rail connection linking it to the forward logistics base network. Israel's Red Sea port, the only non-Mediterranean maritime import pathway, was struck by 18 weapons that destroyed its container handling infrastructure and severed its road and rail connections to the rest of the country. By sunrise, On day one, 90% of Israel's maritime import capacity was gone. The IDF's logistics system, which depends on continuous seaborne resupply to replenish the consumables that combat operations burn through at rates no domestic stockpile can cover indefinitely, had lost its primary replenishment pathway before most people in Tel Aviv were awake. Phase 2 had already begun before Phase 1 was fully concluded. 12 major road bridge crossings on the primary logistics routes between Israel's central stockpile complex and its northern and southern operational fronts were struck with precision weapons, achieving structural collapse at the bridge deck level. Not damage requiring repair, destruction requiring complete reconstruction. Rail lines serving the northern logistics corridor were struck at 9 separate points, each chosen to maximize the length of track rendered unusable by a single impact. Rather than attacking vehicles on roads, a tactic that is costly and produces only temporary disruption, Iran's planners attacked the infrastructure itself. A destroyed bridge cannot be bypassed when every bridge on every alternate route has also been destroyed. The IDF's overland logistics capability was not degraded. It was structurally eliminated, is greater than Phase 3, operating between hours 18 and 36, targeted the forward logistics depots, the stockpiles maintained in theater to sustain operations for a defined period without resupply. These facilities are hardened, they are dispersed, their locations are among the most closely held operational secrets in the IDF system. The fact that Iranian targeting databases included accurate location data for the majority of these facilities is itself a finding whose intelligence implications extend far beyond the immediate military situation. 11 of Israel's 14 identified forward logistics depots were struck. The 3 that survived were located within urban areas where the collateral damage calculus constrained the strike package, a constraint that Iran's planners appear to have consciously incorporated into their planning. The surviving depot inventory represented between 3 and 7 days of supply at current consumption rates, and that clock was already running. Phase 4 addressed the emergency resupply pathway that American and Israeli planners had identified as the primary compensating mechanism for maritime and overland interdiction, air logistics, runways at Ben Gurion International Airport. The primary entry point for air-delivered military cargo were struck at 6 separate points with penetrating warheads designed to produce subsurface detonations, creating craters resistant to emergency repair. Ramon Airport was struck simultaneously. Military airfields with runway capacity to handle heavy cargo aircraft had already been rendered non-operational in preceding strikes on IDF bases. By the end of Phase 4, Israel had no functional air cargo terminal capable of receiving the heavy lift aircraft that emergency military resupply requires. The air bridge Washington required to execute emergency resupply simply did not exist in this scenario, and more importantly, it was not a failure of immediate improvisation. It was a condition imposed from the outset by a sequence of earlier operational losses and deliberate targeting of logistics capacity. What emerged in Phase 5 was not a single isolated military maneuver, but a prolonged interdiction campaign designed to prevent not only resupply, but the very possibility of restoring supply continuity. Every attempt to rebuild logistics pathways was met with systematic disruption, turning what might have been temporary battlefield setbacks into a sustained structural collapse. When Israeli engineering units attempted emergency repairs on destroyed road crossings, those efforts were repeatedly neutralized. Heavy equipment brought in to restore mobility was struck before it could complete meaningful reconstruction, and partially restored infrastructure was rendered unusable again. Similarly, ad hoc maritime resupply efforts through commercial or improvised arrangements toward Ashdod were effectively denied viability through persistent interdiction pressure. Over time, the operational message became unmistakable. There would be no temporary gap in the supply chain to exploit, because the supply chain itself was being actively suppressed as an ongoing condition of the battle space rather than a discrete event. Much of the conventional analysis of such a situation tends to focus narrowly on military exchanges, strikes, counterstrikes, and territorial dynamics. However, that perspective misses the far more decisive factor, logistics degradation, and its cascading human and operational consequences. In modern mechanized warfare, the collapse of supply chains does not merely constrain operations. It fundamentally transforms the combat effectiveness of entire formations, often without direct engagement being required. Within this framework, the most critical variable became fuel. An armored force of roughly brigade scale consumes vast quantities of diesel daily across tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery tractors, and logistics convoys. Scaled across multiple brigades in active deployment, daily fuel consumption reaches levels that require uninterrupted resupply pipelines. Once those pipelines were disrupted and pre-existing reserves were reduced by earlier phases of targeting, the remaining fuel stocks effectively imposed a countdown on operational mobility. As inventories declined, armored units began experiencing increasing rates of immobilization, not due to enemy fire, but due to mechanical stagnation caused by fuel depletion. The shift from maneuver warfare to static positioning occurred not through tactical defeat, but through logistical exhaustion. Aviation operations followed a similarly constrained trajectory. Modern air forces depend on continuous and high-volume fuel throughput to maintain sortie rates. As inventories tightened, air operations were progressively throttled back. Mission planning shifted from operational optimization to fuel preservation. High-end strike platforms, normally central to deep operational doctrine, were increasingly rationed. The effect was not immediate cessation of air power, but a gradual reduction in tempo that altered the balance between intended operational reach and actual achievable output. Air superiority, while still present in form, became increasingly limited in function. Ammunition supply presented another accelerating constraint. Artillery systems, armored units, and precision strike capabilities all depend on high-volume consumable stocks that cannot be rapidly regenerated under sustained interdiction. As forward depots were drawn down, units were forced to reduce firing rates, prioritize targets, and eventually cease certain categories of fire missions altogether. What had once been sustained offensive capability began transitioning into selective engagement and then into conservation-driven inactivity. The battlefield effect was cumulative. Reduced firepower led to reduced tactical pressure, which in turn limited operational flexibility. Food, logistics, often underestimated in high-level military discourse, introduced a slower but equally consequential form of degradation. Sustaining large deployed forces requires continuous ration distribution through structured supply chains. As those chains weakened, frontline units began drawing on emergency reserves intended only for short-duration contingencies. Over time, this shifted from precautionary consumption to necessity. Nutritional degradation does not immediately remove combat capability, but it alters endurance, cognitive performance, and decision-making under stress. An army that is physically sustained but nutritionally constrained does not fail instantly. It degrades in effectiveness in ways that accumulate across time and across units. Medical logistics added another layer of constraint that directly affected operational decision-making. Field medical systems rely on uninterrupted resupply of consumables such as blood products, surgical supplies, and pharmaceuticals. These inventories are inherently limited in forward conditions and cannot be easily substituted. As shortages emerged, medical units were forced to triage not only casualties, but also procedures and resource allocation. This created a secondary constraint on operational tempo, as commanders increasingly had to factor medical capacity into tactical planning. In modern warfare, degraded medical logistics does not remain confined to humanitarian impact. It feeds back into operational risk calculation at every level. Taken together, these cascading shortages created a compounding system of operational friction. What initially appeared as discrete logistical challenges evolved into a unified constraint across mobility, firepower, sustainment, and medical support. The result was not immediate collapse, but progressive narrowing of operational possibility space. Each day reduced the range of viable military actions until commanders were no longer choosing between optimal options, but between increasingly limited and often reactive alternatives. From a strategic planning perspective, what is most significant is not simply the material depletion itself, but the speed and completeness with which logistical assumptions were invalidated. Many established military models assume that emergency resupply, allied support, or rapid adaptation can stabilize a deteriorating supply situation. In this case, those assumptions fail to align with operational reality. The disruption of logistics was not episodic, but sustained, and therefore resistant to standard recovery mechanisms. The broader implication of this scenario is that modern high-intensity warfare is ultimately governed less by direct combat outcomes and more by the integrity of supply networks under stress. Once those networks transition from resilient systems to continuously degraded structures, the operational behavior of even advanced military forces changes fundamentally. Mobility decreases, strike frequency declines, and decision-making becomes increasingly shaped by scarcity rather than strategy. In that sense, the most important outcome of this 5-day period is not a tactical shift on the battlefield, but a strategic demonstration that when supply chains are reduced to intermittent or non-functional states under sustained pressure, the combat system they support begins to self-limit, regardless of its original design strength.